Hi, this is Jen Rubin from Jen Rubin's Green Room and from the Washington Post. What a week it has been. We have had economic news, we've had domestic political news, we have had international news. So let's talk about each one of these. On the economic front, once again, we see this ginormous gap between the actual results of President Biden's policies and the way the economy and he is covered in the mainstream media. We have 4.9% growth in the third quarter, which is almost unheard of. We have continuing job growth. We have inflation that is declining, but is still, granted, higher than the 2% target by the Federal Reserve. We have an enormous increase in wealth since 2020, and yet Biden seems to get no credit for any of it. I have to laugh when I look at these headlines, because otherwise you would cry, that say things like 4.9% growth, but it's not expected to last. Well, of course it's not supposed to last. You never have 4.9% over an extended period of time. But the point is that all those people who were chattering and jammering about a recession look foolish, and they should own up to the fact that they have been fear-mongering and running down the economy and running down Biden's economic achievements for a very long time. And not only are we doing well in terms of our own economy, but if you look in comparison to the world, we're running circles around the world in terms of growth, economic recovery, in terms of getting a handle on inflation. And you can either say it has nothing to do with Biden, in which case you shouldn't blame him whenever gas prices go up or other bad things happen, or you should say, listen, presidents have something to do with the economy. Not everything. There are independent factors, but this president has hit upon a formula that actually works, and that is investing in things that are going to make a long-term difference in growth and productivity, and making sure that we are no longer throwing money at the super rich, but they were attempting to create good paying jobs for working class and middle class people. And that has been successful. We're having a renaissance of manufacturing in this country. We're having a job boom in its entirety. And that is something that is worth celebrating. And that is something that you cannot, if you're in a position to support President Biden, you cannot repeat often enough, because the perception is so vastly different than the reality. And I get it. I get people who've been kind of through the ringer. I get the fact that prices are higher than they were a few years ago. Prices are always higher than they were a few years ago. Prices don't retreat. They don't go backwards. And if they do, we're in a terrible recession, and that would be a bad thing. But it's okay to say this is a success. And I think the Biden administration is trying its best to do it. I think their surrogates need to do it more. And frankly, the press needs to be a little bit more responsible in terms of giving this guy his due. So let's turn to the domestic front. On speaker number 5, the Republicans have finally elected, lo and behold, an extreme MAGA figure, Mike Johnson of Louisiana. This is a guy who not only signed onto a brief that was going to disenfranchise millions of people after the 2020 election, he was the guy who organized it. This is the guy who tried to overthrow the results of the election, and he is now second in line to the presidency, right behind Kamala Harris. In addition, this guy is a religious nut, and by that I mean he subscribes to all of the extreme Christian nationalist views, which is, number one, there should be no abortion nationwide ban. Number two, he has continually, I don't want to say discriminated against, but certainly supported measures that have an adverse effect on LGBTQ Americans. He is a denier when it comes to climate change. He's a nut. And this bodes very well for the Republican crazies. For the rest of us, it's very bad news, because we will have a shutdown unless saner voices prevail. And we do have at issue support for Ukraine, support for Israel. And more importantly, you just have confirmation. I don't know how many times we have to point to it, that there are no moderates in the Republican Party. Where are these 20 or 30 people who are always supposed to defend functional government, who are conservative, but they're not crazy? They fold like a cheap suitcase every single time. And once again, they did here. So long as the far right wing was objecting to one speaker choice after another, they were fine to go along. But as soon as the Matt Gaetzes, the Jim Jordans found someone who would do their bidding, the Lawlers, the Nancy Maces, all of these people who are supposed moderates, they just fall into line. Well, if Democrats are smart, they will tie every single one of these people to this lunatic. And I think we have to be very clear. If you're voting for Republicans, any Republican, because they have no spine of their own, you're voting for the most extreme MAGA characters. You're voting for dysfunction. You're voting for nihilism. And you're voting for a rancid brand of bigotry that does not hold women, does not hold LGBTQ people, does not hold Blacks and Hispanics as equals in a multiracial, multi-ethnic society. This is a noxious view. This is white supremacy at its worst. And I think Republicans have made a very bad assumption if they think this doesn't contribute to the overall impression of their party. Last time I looked, support for the Congress as a whole, which I think people usually mean the House, is down to something like 11%. Actually, I'd like to know who those 11% of people are. Who out there thinks this group is doing a great job? Well, I don't envy the White House because they're going to have to deal with these people. They're going to have to figure out how to keep the government operating. They're going to have to contribute in some way to a sane outlook on foreign policy that allows us to support our allies, that does not seek refuge in bunker America. It will not be easy. So that brings us to the international situation. And here I cannot really convey the depth of my sorrow, my disgust, my angst. It's bad enough that you had the worst pogrom in Jewish history since the Holocaust. It's bad enough that you have over 200 people who have been kidnapped and are hidden away someplace in Gaza, if they are still alive. It's bad enough that you have an Israeli government that is incapable of showing empathy, that uses still dehumanizing, awful language. That in and of itself would be terrible enough. But what we've seen in the United States, mostly on college campuses, but abroad as well, is the most vicious anti-Semitism, a pro-Hamas segment of the far left, which I did not think exists, but it does, out there cheering Hamas, cheering their chant from the river to the sea, meaning all that is in Israel, not only forget about the West Bank, we're talking about pre-49 Israel, they should all be wiped out and the Jews should be wiped out as well. And they insist on treating Israel as if it's an illegitimate colonial state. They insist upon treating Hamas as the true representative of the Palestinian people, which is horrific insofar as Palestinians are the victims of Hamas as well. And they treat the only good Jew as a dead Jew. In other words, when Israel chooses to defend itself, suddenly that's equivalent to a war crime. And this is bunk. This is dehumanizing, straight up anti-Semitism. And I'd like to just repeat 5 essential points that this crowd would love to ignore. First, Israel does not occupy Gaza. They left entirely in 2006. Hamas has been single-handedly running Gaza ever since. So this notion of free Palestine, I'd like to grab some of those signs and say free Palestine from Hamas, because Hamas is the occupying power. Secondly, Israel is not committing war crimes. First of all, it fully complied with international law in signaling a warning. Secondly, it has allowed humanitarian aid into Gaza. Third, it is not targeting civilians. Yes, there will be civilian casualties, and that is a direct result of Hamas's decision to hide behind the skirts of women and children and other innocents. That is not a war crime. All that the laws of war demand are that Israel target appropriate military targets and, when feasible, try to avoid civilian casualties. And that is what they've done. There's been zero evidence to the contrary. And you recall when this hospital had an explosion, instantaneously, the Israel haters rallied to scream this was a war crime. Well, it turned out to be a Hamas rocket or a jihadist rocket gone astray. And by the way, not only was there no apology, but there was no outrage at the Palestinians who actually caused the danger, who killed their own people. Third key point, you can disdain the Netanyahu government, as I do. You can criticize it as being authoritarian, as I do. You can object to its West Bank policies, as I do, without leaping to the conclusion that Israel is an illegitimate state, that Hamas is the savior of the people of the Middle East. You have to exercise some moral judgments, make some moral distinctions. Is it really that hard to understand that you can disagree with Netanyahu and not support cutting off the heads of babies and kidnapping grandmothers? This is not rocket science, excuse the bad pun. So that's the third point. Fourth point, the Palestinians are in fact victims. They are victims in large part of Hamas. Hamas has taken aid from them. Hamas has used them as human shields. Hamas has forced Israel and other countries to set up a blockade because whatever comes in, they convert to a weapon. And we've seen right now that despite their best hopes for limiting material that could be turned into weapons, they somehow managed to do this. They somehow managed to take whatever is allowed into Gaza and turn it into a deadly weapon, which, by the way, they use in a manner that is entirely categorized as a war crime. When they send up these missiles, they are not directed. They are launched in the direction of civilian populations. That in and of itself is a war crime. And finally, what I would say is there is a connection here, Republicans, and I've talked a lot about the radical left, but let's talk about the insane right for a moment. Russia, Iran is on the side of Hamas. This is what they do. These people who are determined to create death, to create dissension in the West, to violate sovereignty of nations, who commit atrocities, they're all on the same side. And if you are rooting for Putin, if you are saying Ukraine does not deserve our support, you are on the side of Russia, Iran, and Hamas. It's that simple. I know these Republicans would love to come up with all of these excuses for why we can't support Ukraine, or all of these apologies for what Putin has done. But that is the same as what Hamas has done. The Russians have targeted civilians. They've committed atrocities. We are documenting those war crimes. And so I don't want to really hear how much you love Israel and how badly you feel about the terrorist attacks, unless you're also willing to take the same position vis-a-vis Russia and their attacks on Ukraine civilians. And if you'll recall, one of the first voices to speak out was Zelensky, because he knows a war crime when he sees it. He knows what it is to have innocents slaughtered. And I think we should listen to him and listen to President Biden, who, by the way, I think has gotten it largely right. Each of these things that we were just talking about, the right of Israel to defend itself, the heinous nature of Hamas, the victimization of innocent Palestinians, he has articulated very well. And those who criticize him for being too pro-Israel, whatever that means, I think ignore that he has been incredibly sympathetic, incredibly clear about not only the welfare of Palestinians, but the need, when all of this is over, to get back to the peace process, if you can really call it that, but some effort to reduce tensions, some effort to improve the lot of the lives of Palestinians. So I give him high marks. Again, is it recognized? Not really. Does he get credit? Not really. But I wish people on all sides of the equation would really listen to him, because I think he's gotten the moral message right, that we are in a battle. And by we, I mean civilization, decency, humanity is in a battle against terrorism, against atrocities, against death, against mayhem. And you got to choose a side, and you have to be consistent when you choose that side. So on that rather sad note, we end this week. And tonight I will be going to my local synagogue in Washington, D.C., to stand in solidarity with several families who are the victimization of a terrible tragedy. Each one of them is the family to someone who has been kidnapped and is currently being held in Gaza. And if we can do nothing else, it can be to stand in solidarity with those who have and still are going through unspeakable horrors. And so if you pray, say a word of prayer. If you don't pray, use your political voice to come down on the side of decency and kindness and empathy. And keep your spirits up, because as hard as it is, next week's going to start. You're going to have new challenges. There are going to be elections coming up in Virginia and elsewhere. And you got to stay strong for the long term, because we are in an existential battle for civilization. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed this, please tell your friends. They can listen to this, and they can join me each week on Jen Rubin's Green Room. You can get that podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Bye-bye.